Well,
No.
there's a one year inspection that I hold about one.
Yeah.
I'm young. I don't also. And then. Orange Alex. Well, there's a 4 point. That's where I was doing that, like, for the black. My whole year. Wow. I've actually never used it, but everyone always talks about it. Oh, no, right. Oh, sorry. Eagles fan over there.
I was there.
Oh, really? Yeah, you need to give other. See?
Yeah.
Yeah. Do this. What is a little raised? I'll never fail in class. All right, yeah, I'm taking the one you see. Okay, so the other thing with these are the third. I know, but. Now, all time. Then have time that. Get the thunder, so. Right. I didn't really want to. I don't want to. Suns are on your side of the track, by the way. I got oh, that's there. No. That's good. You know, like stones or bricks a lot more higher. Like color.
Is that
I feel like maybe
Okay, good morning. Let's go ahead and get rolling. Hope your week is going well as we close out and get to Friday. I'm looking forward to the weekend. I'm going to go see a concert. I'm going to go see the band Muse perform because it's going to be really silly. Frankly, our time is running out. So to get started for today, as a quick recap, we looked at uncertainty reduction theory, or URT, last class. That was theory number 2. That's designed to explore and understand our human relationships, right? This theory got at the idea that we experience uncertainty in our social interactions with other people, right? Stranger danger. But through the process of communicating and spending more time with people, we develop comfort and trust in one another. We use the example of the idea of catfishing, including in the TV show Catfish, right? Where people present false identities online and people try to meet them face to face to figure out if they really are who they say they are, which is the process of uncertainty reduction. Again, this is not graded, but this is a chance for you to review. This theory brought in a whole bunch of different axioms, right, or laws about how people will behave. So high levels of uncertainty produce blank reciprocity, while low levels of uncertainty produce blank reciprocity. Does anybody want to take a stab at this? How might we fill this in? Yeah.
high levels produce high velocity and lower.
Yes, yes. So if we're breaking this down, right? So when people don't know each other very well, their communication is very reciprocal. It's very one-to-one. People generally go back and forth, and the amount of time they're talking is pretty even. How are you doing today? Oh, I'm good. How are you? What's your major? Oh, I'm chemistry. What's yours? Right? It's very back and forth because you're sharing a lot of superficial information. But if you know somebody well, if you're good friends, it's generally to be said that you're going to have conversations that are more lopsided. You have a friend who just is venting at you about your day, or maybe you're preparing for a job and they take an hour to really support you and talk to you and listen, right? So as we get to know people better, we're comfortable with different conversational patterns. As a quick reminder, the class presentation form is linked on Canvas. Please complete that by the end of the day today if you haven't done so already. Basically, starting next week, I'll have the schedule posted for when people will present. And then as we get into later weeks in the term, starting in week 4, I'll have people slotted for the different days to share their articles and the ways that they link to the theory. Consider both your availability, including travel, and then if there are any theories from the course that seem especially interesting that you would like to talk about further. So today, theory number 3 that we'll be looking at is social exchange theory. So we'll talk a little bit about what this theory is all about. And I also have an example of an article that could be used as an outside article. If you were giving a presentation on this theory, how you could give that presentation to discuss. Also, remember that you have your reflection paper that's due a week from Sunday. Remember that you have the option to use any of the theories that we've been using to start out the class. So you could pick any one of these three or any of the ones next week that seem especially interesting to you, right? So these theories we've been talking about are all excellent candidates from which you could choose. And we have the week 2 quiz due by this Sunday. A couple of you have already finished that. Just know that that is coming up. So social exchange theory, right? This is a theory that's talked about in a lot of interpersonal communication. You might have run into this before in interpersonal communication, but you might also have run into it in things like sociology, psychology, or other related fields. Again, every theory comes in with a major assumption, right? A pair of glasses that you are bringing into this theory. And the assumption that's coming from social exchange theory is, and again, not all theories are going to resonate with you. People are thinking about and choosing the relationships in their lives on the basis of the relationship's worth. In other words, they are considering and weighing the benefits and costs of their relationships and making a decision about the relationships that they choose to make. This is a theory that's socio-psychological because it's explaining the human processes and cognition that we do behind our decisions for relationships. Again, it's intra and interpersonal. We're making decisions in our heads and through our interactions about the worth that we have on our relationships. And it takes on a more positivistic and empirical approach as well. A lot of the early theories in the class are going to take on that approach because they're interested in kind of studying and quantifying human behavior. A lot of interpersonal communication is quantitative, right? It's using things like surveys, experiments to understand a lot of those relationships. So we'll notice a lot of that early on. And then as an application or example, right, I mentioned last class, I watch a lot of bad reality TV. If you are familiar with a lot of reality television shows such as The Bachelor or Bachelorette, right, a lot of these programs, the premise, right, is that you have a person who is trying to look for a relationship, supposedly, or trying to look for social media influence and is choosing to date other contestants and people on the show. And over the process of being on the show is making decisions about who they want to continue to have around, who they eliminate from the show, right? In shows like Bachelor or Bachelorette, there is a rose that they give out to various contestants. There are fewer and fewer available, right? So if you don't get a rose, you get sent home. And in the context of a lot of programming like that, right, there is social exchange decisions that are being made. How do I value our relationship? Is this a relationship worth continuing, and why? So this theory comes from John Thibault and Harold Kelly. As I mentioned, not every theory is going to come from people in communication. A lot of these theories are relevant. They have a lot of scholarship and work in communication, but they might not originate there. Again, things such as cultural studies are coming from other places too. But from the realm of social psychology, the idea of making exchanges and decisions, it's been brought in as a way of understanding communication. So communication theory is cool because we're pretty interdisciplinary. We borrow and draw from a lot of other areas. The best way that I can break down this theory for you, right, and to really give you a concrete picture of what this theory is and what this theory talks about is through a mathematical equation, right? Worth equals rewards minus cost. So this is essentially what this theory suggests for how we choose the relationships that we form with other people, right? In other words, a cost is a negative value or consequence that can come as the result of our relationships. For example, one cost of our relationship is time. You really value and you enjoy talking to your aunt, but your aunt is very chatty. You realize that you had an hour and a half long conversation, and it was the night before you had to study for a big test. So that can be a cost. Money, such as traveling to visit a relative who's very far away, navigating perhaps treacherous weather in your efforts to get there, that can be a cost too, right? Cost can also be things including the kind of emotional toll or impact the relationship has, right? So cost can also be considering the ways in which you feel negatively impacted by the relationship. For example, if you were with somebody who is disrespectful to you, abusive to you, right? Those are things that we would also consider to be in the realm of costs. Whereas rewards are the things that we really get out of or benefit from our relationships. For example, we might really enjoy and find the person interesting. We might value somebody on the basis of them being family, being close to us, and feeling a tight bond with that person, right? We might also consider that a reward is fun. We get to spend time together, we get to do activities together, we enjoy it, right? So when we take on those things together, we determine the worth. Overall, is the relationship a net good or a net bad for us, right? And the outcome of that, right? The outcome of the relationship's worth is to make a decision as to whether or not we continue with the relationship. If the worth in subtracting rewards and costs outweighs the costs, then yeah, we want to continue that relationship. We enjoy it. It's easy. It's fun. We like it. But if we feel that a relationship is too costly, it's a detriment to our lives, we don't see value in the relationship, we might be more likely to end the relationship. In other words, it's using the metaphor of a marketplace to describe human relationships. Right? Draws a lot from things like game theory to understand why we behave the way that we do. In other words, we are looking at our options available to us. If you're investing in stocks, right, you're looking at growth, potential that you see in your investment, and you're making decisions about where that goes. So there's a lot of assumptions here, right? And again, there's a lot of critique of this theory that we're going to be talking about a bit in this class. But the central assumption here is that human beings, at the end of the day, we're guided by self-interest. We got to get our food, our shelter, our basic resources at the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Then we work our way up into our social relationships, right? Seeking things like comfort, belonging, connection with other people. So if that is what we want as human beings, that's going to impact the relationships that we choose to form. This theory also suggests that we think rationally about our relationships. In other words, we're thinking about our relationship in a more kind of detached way. Is this a good relationship or not? And people create and maintain relationships in order to fulfill their self-interest, right? So if our goal is to have a meaningful and well-rounded life, how do our relationships with others, be they friends, family, romantic relationships, fit within that broader frame? So there's a few different elements of this theory that I want to get into and explain in a little bit more detail. I think will help us to pick this apart too. One of the ideas here is the idea of interdependence, right? So the idea is that when we find ourselves involved in relationships with other people, these are relationships that are interdependent and closely connected. Think about it kind of like if you have an arch, right, you have a keystone that's holding all of the rocks together, this rock in the middle here. You take out that keystone, the rock's going to fall apart. And in the same way, our relationships are these kind of carefully constructed rocks that are put together to make sense of how we interact, right? In other words, a relationship is interdependent. We have people who are counting on each other in different ways, sometimes in different levels, depending on how in-depth and meaningful that relationship is. So for instance, maybe in a very casual relationship, you just enjoy talking to somebody a little bit, but maybe with a close friend or partner, like you share a vehicle, you ride share, you share finances, right? You are depending upon each other for support. That can be a big reward that comes in relationships. Another thing to think about is power, right? Power in terms of the authority or influence that people wield over one another in a partnership. We know, for instance, in romantic context, that the history of marriage as institution has been one concerned with power. We've seen a shift toward a lot more kind of egalitarian and equitable distributions of power in partnerships, but the idea of decisions as to how ownership of materials is used, whether or not one party takes another person's last name, right? Those are questions of power as they play out in relationships, consent, and decisions that people make in those relationships too. Interdependence also connects to conflict, right? So do you fight? You argue? What does that look like? We have a class at EOU called conflict management, right? And The important element here is that conflict is not inherently bad, right? Just because two friends are getting into a fight with each other, or two romantic partners are disagreeing with each other, does not mean that that's a bad or toxic relationship. It could certainly be, right? I don't mean to downplay circumstances where that's true, but conflict can help people to work through and understand their differences and reach a better place than where they started. Interdependence is also about coordination. Maybe that's like logistical coordination. So, my uncle is going to take us to the airport, and then your dad is going to pick us up, right? So you work together to figure out and manage things together. There's the possibility of future interdependence, right? Where is the relationship going from here? Maybe you decide that you and a good friend are going to be roommates because that saves money. You're both paying a whole lot for rent. And relational certainty is another crucial element. How sure are you that this relationship is going to continue? Again, we see this example play out a lot in things like reality TV shows, like Bachelor, Bachelorette, Love Island, all of those things, right? Where people are like dating and trying to flirt and spend time with other people because they don't have relational certainty. They're worried that their current relationship isn't going to work, so they look at their other options. Secondarily, we have what's considered to be the evaluation of the relationship itself. In other words, right, we are looking at how satisfied and happy we are with the relationship just as it exists on its own. How do you feel about spending time with this person? Are you happy? Are you sad? Are you frustrated? Are you coming from very similar or very different places? For example, I had a very close friend in high school. We were, really, really close, but we talked again 7 or 8 years later, and we were in very different places in our lives, right? We realized we didn't have a whole lot in common, and we didn't really talk much anymore, right? So we didn't feel the same satisfaction within the relationship that we might have felt at other points. And then there's the comparison level for alternatives. Again, we might see this especially commonly in dating contexts. You maybe have gone on a few different first dates with a few different people. You're trying to get a feel for people that you might enjoy spending time and talking to. But you're kind of figuring out, well, who do I want to dedicate most of my time to, right? Or maybe you live in a divorced household, or you deal with kind of multiple family members, right? Who do I choose to spend time with? Who do I go to see for the holidays? That can be a difficult question to answer, and one that we reach on the basis of comparing our relationships to other options. How many people have ever heard of the concept of the prisoner's dilemma? Okay, so a couple of you. So there are a lot of different models of how the exact numbers of this play out. But the prisoner's dilemma is a way of helping us to explain our human behavior, and particularly the decisions that we might make about our relationships, especially as we're considering multiple options. I'm going to share a short clip that talks a little bit about the prisoner's dilemma, because I think it's a useful way of helping us to understand why it is that we might choose to evaluate relationships in the way that we do.
The prisoner's dilemma is one example of something game theory studies. Let's assume Alex and Tom are caught stealing wallets. Game theory assumes they're both rational and self-interested. The regular punishment for what they did is 1 year in jail each. However, let's also assume the police expect one of them was involved in a more serious offense, stealing valuable paintings from a museum. Alex is offered a deal by the police. If she testifies against Tom for the more serious crime, and Tom doesn't testify against her, she gets 0 jail time, but Tom gets 8 years. Tom gets the same offer. If none of them testifies, each person only gets 1 year in jail. If both of them testify, they get 3 years each. Obviously, it seems in their best interest that neither of them testifies, as only 2 years of total jail time would result, 1 for each. However, let's look at things from their perspective. Alice sees that if she doesn't testify, there are 2 outcomes, one in which she gets 1 year and one in which she gets 8. She then sees that if she testifies, she either gets 0 jail time or 3 years. Testifying, therefore, seems more appealing. The same thing goes for Tom. Game theory therefore predicts that both of these rational, self-interested people would end up testifying and receiving 3 years each. Definitely not the ideal outcome. Please know, however, that various real-world experiments have proven people are more inclined to cooperate than this model would indicate. So take it with a grain of salt.
So prisoner's dilemma, right, is dealing with the idea, and again, the exact numbers for the amount of years look a little bit different depending on the model you're drawing from. But they suggest, right, that collectively, there's the best outcome. In this case, the best outcome here is both making a decision not to testify, in which case they only get a year each. But if one of them is silent and the other testifies, then they get off scot-free, the other person gets more time. So in other words, there is the option that does the least harm for both people, getting a year each, or there is the option where you gain and the other person loses because you are kind of exploiting their trust and breaking that trust with the other person. If we apply this model to try to understand and evaluate our relationships, in theory, we're compelled by relationships that are mutually beneficial, right? Where both parties are gaining something. But strategically, as self-interested humans, we might choose a relationship in which we have something to gain. The other party doesn't have that same amount, right? They don't get as much out of the relationship. But we continue the relationship because there's something in it for us, right? That's something that this theory is arguing, that we have a strategic reason to maintain relationships, even if we're getting more out of a relationship than the other person. Another consideration here is the idea of behavior sequences, right? So under this theory, it's dealing with the idea that it's explaining human behavior. What are the relationships that we're choosing to make, and why are we choosing to make the relationships that we are, right? So one way of trying to impact those relationships is the idea of fate control. We might choose to maintain a relationship by impacting the outcome the other people experience. For example, one way we might do this, say you're working with somebody in a class, right? You might choose to reach out to them and work with them on a partner activity together because you want to work with them and you see a benefit to doing so, right? You're impacting that person's outcome. Or perhaps you have a family member who is insistent that you go to Oregon State because that's where he went and that's where he thinks you should go. And he says, I'm not going to pay any college money for you unless you go to Oregon State, right? That would be an example of fate control, trying to dictate or impact what's going to happen in other people's lives. On the flip side, we have behavior control, right? That's the idea that you're impacting your own behavior and your own outcomes as a way of affecting or implicating the relationship. So there's a few different ways that you could do this. For instance, you could choose to disclose and share a lot of personal details about your life because you want to see if the person can handle that, if they're willing to listen to you and support you in that way, because that's what you want out of a friendship, right? So again, in a lot of contexts, such as reality television, we see examples of people kind of like playing games, using manipulation, or just using self-disclosure and sharing of information with each other as a way of determining if the relationship is one that works and one that makes sense for both people. So in this way, right, there is what's kind of considered to be a matrix of outcomes. In other words, a relationship, as we see it, has a variety of different ways that it could go. If we spend time with a good friend, we think, oh, that was a good experience. We got a lot out of that. Or we know that, for instance, spending time with a friend is going to be stressful. So when we're looking at our relationships, we're saying, how is this going to play out, right? If we had to predict how our relationship with this person will go, what will happen? There's an effective matrix that's expanding and suggesting all of the different possibilities. So if I spend time on this first date, I could meet somebody that's going to totally change my life. I could feel like it's an absolute waste of time, or I could just meet a new friend, right? So you're looking at the different possibilities and alternatives that could come out. And then the dispositional matrix is suggesting how rewards ought to be exchanged, right? Rewards does not necessarily mean that you're like giving out or handing out a present. It's not something you can necessarily quantify, but think about it as relationships can be rewarding. We feel like we learn more. We feel like we can disclose and share. We feel connected. We feel a sense of community. We feel a sense of family and belonging, right? So how are those feelings, thoughts, and benefits expressed in our relationships? What do we want to see? For example, if you feel like you have a relationship where the other person just talks and talks and talks, you just cannot get a word in edgewise, that would be an issue related to the dispositional matrix. While you feel like they're getting a reward, you're not, and you have concerns with how that's being exchanged between the people. I wanted to show as well an example, right? So again, for the presentations that you'll do starting in the 4th week, I'll be asking you to pick an outside book chapter or journal article that's relevant to the theory, and to give kind of a short presentation talking about this outside article and how this helps us develop the theory. So the example that I give is from a book called The Nature and Function of Social Exchange in Adolescent Romantic Relationships. There's a chapter here about the development of romantic relationships in adolescence. And I wanted to share a little bit so you could see this article in action and see how it connects to what we've been talking about here, right? So this comes from Google Books. There's a preview option to basically see just about all of the chapter, but you can also check EOU Library, Google Scholar for other results and so on. So if we're to look at this article, right? What this article is essentially doing here is using social exchange theory. And again, Thibault and Kelly, the folks that we know developed this theory back in 1959, are being referenced and used here. And as it states, it provides a popular and compelling framework for understanding adult romantic relationships. Economic principles extended into personal behavior, as we've talked about through the example of the prisoner's dilemma and game theory, right? And it recognizes that adolescent relationships have a lot of unique challenges, including people's decisions to develop and explore those relationships, right? So this is, in a lot of these articles, chapters, you're going to see that there's kind of a literature review that goes over work that's talked about and addressed the topic, right? And then it transitions into talking about some of the motivations and reasons that adolescents, right, teenagers are choosing to make decisions about romantic partners. So for example, they talk about evolutionary pressures. They talk about the idea of competition, right? They talk about the idea of cooperation and compassion. So they're linking this to work in evolutionary psychology. They're also talking about some of the critical elements here about how family membership, members of families who are present can impact relationships, right? And then some of the developmental demands that come in and shape people's decisions too. You're a teenager, right? Going through puberty, you're dealing with a lot of complicated and difficult emotions. You're trying to understand sort of, if you experience sexual attraction, what that means and how you want to engage in relationships on that basis, right? So as we look through this, what this article is essentially doing for us is it's allowing us to understand how social exchange theory can be applied and used to understand a particular relationship. So this would be an example of how you could incorporate that outside article in order to explore the topic in more detail. In other words, how might social exchange theory better explain the choices that teenagers make? For example, who are they choosing to spend time with and get to know? Or what can we learn about social exchange theory from applying it in this way? In other words, right, we can learn that there are a variety of factors. For example, we might think about the kind of evolutionary and biological demands that people face in their decisions for relationships, and how if you're a teenager going through puberty, those might feel really important and at times really confusing. In other words, as you're going through and you're providing a presentation in this class, you might ask yourself those questions, right? How might this theory explain this topic that the outside article is talking about? Or what can we learn about this theory from how it's being applied and used in this outside setting? So interdependence and identity development connect in making decisions about dating among adolescents. An example here of how you can incorporate an outside article into theory you might be assigned to the class. As mentioned, right, this has very specific application that we can look at social exchange theory. A form of it anyway really plays out in a lot of reality programming, right? So again, shows such as The Bachelor or Bachelorette very commonly are going to depict like a lead, right? Typically a man or woman who is the person who the various contestants on the show are vying for and will probably break up with like within 3 months of when the show ends, because that's typically how it works. And they break up at a very specific time so that contractually they get to keep the ring and sell it for a lot of money. You know, I'm pretty cynical about these, but in the context of this type of programming, that's how a lot of these relationships are depicted, right? And right, if we have a show like Bachelorette, right, we have our Bachelorette who has a variety of men that she has gotten to know, gone on dates with, spent time with, right? She has a set of roses here, and she has to pick among they are various people, what relationships she wants to continue and which people she would like to send home, right? And she's going to make a lot of factors into that decision, which might include, who do I see potential with? Who am I interested in? Maybe I want to learn more about them, right? Who do I kind of vibe or click with? Are there people that I really connect well with? People where it just didn't work out, right? Sometimes things like physical attraction are really important. I just don't see myself attracted to this person, so I'm going to send them home. They might consider, for instance, what is their level of commitment? Are they interested in getting married? Do they want to have kids? How do we manage things like location? And if they're not a match in that area, then that's going to be a problem too, right? So essentially, making a decision based on present information, as well as the possibility of future information, where do I predict this relationship going, are oftentimes reasons that people on shows like this one would make decisions about who to keep and who to send out. So I'm going to ask you to take a bit of time in groups to talk about some of these ideas related to social exchange theory. I'm going to have one person in your groups write or type so that you can share it with the class in a little bit. But I'm going to ask your groups to take some time to address these questions. First of all, based on what you have heard so far and what you understand from social exchange theory, do you think this is a theory that's persuasive or not? Why? Second of all, what is a critique that your group has regarding this theory? In other words, you look at the assumptions and beliefs behind this theory. In what ways is this theory falling flat for you? And then third of all, what is useful about this theory? That is, how does this theory help us? What can we gain from that process? Okay. So why don't we go ahead and do a group of 5 in this set of tables over here. We'll do another group of 5 starting up here and going back here. We'll do, I'll put this up in group 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Then we'll do another group of 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. So take some time to chat about these questions. Have one person write or type. Take about 8 to 10 minutes for you all to discuss, and then we'll talk about this together as a group.
There's a lot that goes into relationships, but the pros and cons. It's kind of hard to talk about. I don't know. It's and then like what they can get like from the relationship. Yeah. Yeah, I think it would cost benefit that we can do in my relationship. And that's what it does. Yeah. That is. it's keep going first. Doesn't really. That's my main. It hasn't been.
Oh, that's a good. So most of you guys find that. I think it's.
Trying to benefit or something. And use specialty.
They said like. Outcomes, whether.
Sad note.
But that also doesn't consider like your feelings for like depending on how the relationship is happening. Or still like,
I realize that. One, two, we're into this. I don't know how that fixes.
I'll give your groups about 3 or 4 more minutes to you do your discussion here and so you can share.
We're right here. We're right. You decide.
Take another minute or 2 to finish up.
That's all.
Looks like folks are just about done here. So I'm going to have us go around and a couple groups brought up that it's, some of your answers to these questions kind of merge with each other. That's fine, right? It's a chance for us talk about this theory as a whole and your perspectives on this theory. So let's start with this group of 5 over here. So what were your thoughts about this theory? You know, what is good about it? What's bad about it? What are your perspectives?
So we started by saying we found social exchange theory to be persuasive. We said as a group that it's not the sole factor that decides relationships, but cost benefit is absolutely something that needs to be considered or considered when you build relationships with others. The critique we have is that it removes emotion and feelings towards the person in the relationship. People value relationships differently in this theory, approaches it purely from a reward-based view. And then for the third one, we said social exchange theory acts as sort of a platform to build a relationship upon. As we mentioned, it's not the decisive factor, but it can act as like a building block in which a relationship can grow.
Yeah. So that's a good kind of way to start thinking about this theory, right? The theory is not like a full understanding of our relationships, but it can be useful as understanding a bit of a groundwork. I like the way you brought up that there are other factors that go into people's decisions about forming relationships, you know, things such as emotion, things such as culture, right? To what degree are certain relationships deeply valued and seen as important in a way that's not necessarily measured in that mechanism? So I appreciated some of the ways that you all were adding to understanding. How about the middle group over here?
We also said it was persuasive because, like, in general, in building relationships, you're either trying to like do things or say things to like persuade like certain emotions to come to surface, or like have them do something so you can reciprocate like a certain emotion. So like you can see if that relationship is like what you want, or just like I think just like emotions are persuasive. So we feel like that like fits with this theory. And then a critique we said was that the math equation doesn't really fall under like emotions, because people can like fit that equation and say what you want to hear and everything, but it's not actually what is like beneficial for you, or like what that relationship actually is. Or like you could also be like, this is like what I want, so you're trying to like fit things into a certain like equation when it's not actually what it is. And then we said for like something useful is that it's helps with understanding relationships and possibly like predicting behavior and explaining like social behavior when you're out.
Yeah. You know, a lot of us have probably heard the expression, so-and-so is great on paper, right? The idea that if we think about like whether it's a romantic relationship or a friend, that yeah, like you might have a lot in common and a lot that really lines up and makes sense, but that doesn't mean you really like the person or really connect or vibe with the person, right? Sometimes there are things where it doesn't quite make sense, but there is something that you feel with somebody else, even if you're not sharing quite the same things with them, right? Perhaps there's novelty in a relationship or personality offsets that make sense in a way that you wouldn't see elsewhere, right? So using that mathematical equation to explain relationships might not get at some of those other elements that are impacting your decisions and why you're choosing the relationships that you are, right? So I appreciated kind of bringing in the role of emotion to explain some of those things as well. How about up here?
We also said it was persuasive, surprise. And one of the biggest things that I found, how do I put it? The reason behind that was because of our culture and how what we do in America, how it's very centered around the individual and improving himself and what's beneficial for me and that sort of thing. And we found that logic is similar to this theory. And that's one of the reasons why it's useful, is that it kind of distances yourself from that empathy and whatnot to actually just look at the pros and cons of something and whether or not it's beneficial for you or the company or whatever. But that critique is also that, as you were saying, it separates that emotion, and that's not the whole picture of like a good relationship.
Yeah, and you know, your group is hitting on as well, right? Like, this is a theory that makes sense in the context of a lot of Western cultures in the United States, right? It's no accident that it was invented by two dudes in the 1950s from the West, right? So it is developed as a theory that is useful in that culture and context. We'll be looking at some other theories in the class, like base negotiation theory, that don't necessarily have that Western focus or bent, right? That have very different conclusions about our social relationships and why we choose them. So the context under which theory is developed is important. Who developed this theory, from where are they coming from, why, Are they assuming particular things about our relationships? Because you're right, this is a theory that might make sense to explain cultures that might be more driven by personal success and well-being, whereas more collectivist cultures tend to be driven much more by the needs of the group, even if they come at the expense of the individual. Then how about here in this back corner?
We said it was persuasive as well because of the cost benefit analysis. So someone is more likely to have a self-interest and a big priority. And critique would be that we can't assume that everybody's selfish and avoid punishment. And what is useful in this theory is that it helps maintain relationships by giving and receiving, helps understand individual motives.
Yeah. Right. So we can't necessarily assume that everybody is selfish, right? That sometimes we are choosing a relationship that, on paper is not, particularly positive, right? I will tell you, when I spent multiple months providing home hospice to my dad, right? That was not, if we're looking at it under a mathematical equation, right? That wasn't fun. I was changing his diapers. So if we think about relationships purely as we keep our relationships that are worth it to us in like what we are personally gaining, well, that's not really how we make decisions. We might have commitments, we might have obligations to family, people that we care about. We do things for them that are not necessarily what we personally enjoy, but what help us to feel like we are supporting them in the ways that we know that they need support. So, that's one way of thinking about this too, is that we do feel a sense of commitment and support, even if that doesn't necessarily cleanly fit into the equation either. Another thing that this theory assumes is people's autonomy or power to make decisions about the relationships that they're choosing to continue or not continue, right? So the role of power is important here too. For example, right, there are a lot of people who are in abusive and harmful relationships, and there are a variety of reasons why they stay in those relationships, and a lot of those do relate to power. They relate to finances and financial power and hold. They relate to challenges as it relates to the legal system, right? There are a lot of reasons that people choose to stay in those relationships that to that person make sense to their survival and well-being. Also, a lot of decisions that people make to leave, right? So, people don't necessarily have the power to continue relationships they want to continue and relationships they want to end easily. So there's a lot of other structural factors and considerations that go into those decisions they make. So, I think it's useful for us to think about the sort of broader context of these things. Again, this is a useful theory for explaining some of the guiding decisions, but not necessarily the best at explaining cultural differences and beliefs that people bring into it. So I mentioned this more broadly to say that I encourage you to continue to think critically about these theories. What does it say that resonates and speaks to you that makes sense? What are the things that this theory is not quite speaking to or accounting for, right? None of these theories are going to fully capture everything, but these theories are opportunities for us to continue to workshop, to develop, to grow, and to explore these ideas further. So we talked today about social exchange theory, about how it can be applied and used in our human and social relationships with others. We talked about how, there's ways that this might be seen as callous or detached. People are making very it makes people come off as if they're calculated. Is this a worthwhile relationship? Am I going to stay in this one or not? A lot of you brought up the role of emotions are things that this theory are not quite getting at, but the ability to critique and push back against that is something we'll continue to have in our discussions in class. So have a great weekend. Make sure to complete the week 2 quiz by Sunday. Next week, we will get into social penetration theory that gets at our motivations for self-disclosure and our levels of disclosure with others. Please either email or pass forward your group activity with your names on it. Have a great weekend, and I'll see you Monday.